What if Red Bull hasn't just improved its car with Ford, but accidentally discovered something that changes how a Formula One car responds to a driver at the limit? Behind the scenes, sources suggest the RB22 project uncovered a behavior in power delivery and energy control that engineers weren't even searching for. Not more horsepower. Not better efficiency. Something far more unsettling. Inside the paddock, the reaction hasn't been excitement. It's been disbelief. Because if this discovery scales the way early data implies, it gives Max Verstappen a car that behaves differently under pressure than anything rivals are currently designing. And here's the part that makes this impossible to ignore. The real implication of what Red Bull and Ford have unlocked doesn't show up on a dyno sheet. It only becomes clear once you understand how it changes the driver-car relationship itself. Which is exactly why the people paying closest attention already know this story isn't one you walk away from halfway through. What makes this discovery so destabilizing is that it didn't emerge from a planned performance hunt. It surfaced while Red Bull and Ford were solving a different problem entirely. Engineers were refining how energy is recovered and redeployed under the 2026 rules, trying to smooth out inconsistencies that every manufacturer is struggling with. What they noticed instead was a behavioral shift. Under certain conditions, the power unit didn't just deliver energy more efficiently. It delivered it more intelligently, responding to driver input in a way that reduced the usual trade-off between aggression and stability. That's not something you design deliberately. It's something you recognize only when the data refuses to behave the way you expect. Inside Red Bull, this immediately triggered caution rather than celebration. Because discoveries like this are dangerous. They don't slot neatly into development plans. They force you to rethink assumptions you were comfortable with. If the car can change its response characteristics dynamically without crossing regulatory lines, then traditional limitations stop applying in the same way. Throttle modulation, corner entry commitment, energy harvesting under braking. All of these elements begin to blur together. And when that happens, the car stops feeling like a machine you manage and starts feeling like one that cooperates. What's particularly unsettling is how naturally this behavior appears to align with Verstappen's driving style. Max is at his most effective when the car responds instantly to intent, not correction. He commits early. He carries load aggressively. He expects the rear to work with him, not warn him first. Most cars punish that approach unless perfectly balanced. The data Red Bull is seeing suggests this discovery softens that punishment without removing performance. It doesn't make the car safer. It makes it more honest. And for a driver like Verstappen, honesty at the limit is everything. Rival teams who've heard fragments of this are struggling to categorize it. It's not a power advantage in the traditional sense. It doesn't show up as a big number. It shows up as reduced compromise. The kind of advantage that doesn't dominate qualifying sheets immediately but controls races quietly. When a driver can push lap after lap without negotiating with instability, strategy becomes simpler. Tire life improves indirectly. Mistakes decrease. Pressure shifts outward. Those effects compound in ways simulations rarely capture until it's too late. There's also a deeper concern about scalability. Early indications suggest this behavior isn't fragile. It doesn't disappear outside a narrow window. It persists across different modes, loads, and conditions. That's critical. Because fragile advantages invite scrutiny and correction. Robust ones survive clarification and evolve into standards. If this discovery remains legal and reproducible within the existing framework, Red Bull won't need to protect it aggressively. They'll just refine it quietly while others chase symptoms rather than causes. The FIA is aware of this dynamic, even if no formal discussion has surfaced yet. Not because of any specific rule breach, but because the intent of the regulations was to simplify, not to create emergent behavior that rewards certain philosophies disproportionately. This puts regulators in an uncomfortable position. Intervening now would look speculative. Waiting risks allowing a driver-car synergy that becomes untouchable once races begin. That tension mirrors what we've seen before, just under a different technical language. And this is where the story deliberately holds back its conclusion. Because Red Bull hasn't finished exploring what it's found. Ford hasn't finished understanding why it works. And Verstappen hasn't yet driven it in anger. What exists right now is potential. Dangerous potential. The kind that doesn't announce itself with headlines, but reveals its impact when opponents start asking why nothing they try seems to change the outcome. If this discovery survives the next phase of development, then what Red Bull has unlocked won't just influence lap times. It will redefine how the limit itself feels and who is most comfortable living on it. As engineers began to map out the implications of this behavior, a deeper unease set in across the paddock. Because what Red Bull may have uncovered isn't an advantage you bolt onto a car. It's an interaction effect. A relationship between software logic, electrical response, and mechanical balance that only exists when all three are developed together from the start. That makes it extremely difficult to replicate late. Rivals can copy shapes. They can copy cooling layouts. They cannot easily copy a system that only works because its components were never designed to operate independently in the first place. What's especially troubling is how this discovery changes the definition of the limit. Traditionally, drivers approach the limit cautiously, feeling for instability, correcting, backing off, then building again. The data suggests Red Bull's system reduces that negotiation phase. The car reaches its working state faster and stays there longer. That doesn't make it impossible to overdrive. It makes the warning signs cleaner and earlier. For most drivers, that's helpful. For Verstappen, it's lethal. Because he thrives when the boundary is clear and unforgiving, not vague and inconsistent. Inside Red Bull, this has reportedly led to a subtle but important shift in priorities. Instead of chasing peak performance targets, engineers are focusing on preserving this behavior as the car evolves. That tells you how valuable they believe it is. Peak numbers can be recovered later. Behavior, once lost, is almost impossible to rebuild without starting over. So development becomes protective rather than exploratory. And that kind of mindset usually appears only when a team believes it has already found the core of its concept. Rival teams are particularly concerned about how invisible this advantage could be once racing begins. A car that behaves better under pressure doesn't always top the speed traps. It doesn't always dominate qualifying. But over a race distance, it changes everything. Fewer corrections mean less tire abuse. Cleaner exits mean better energy recovery. Better recovery means more deployment later. The lap time gain isn't one big moment. It's dozens of small ones that add up quietly while others are still fighting their own machinery. There's also a strategic dimension that's only now being discussed. If Verstappen can rely on consistent response regardless of energy mode, Red Bull gains freedom in how it approaches races. They can vary strategy without redesigning the car around it. Aggressive early stints. Defensive late ones. Unexpected deployment patterns. All without destabilizing the platform. That flexibility is something teams normally build toward over several seasons. Red Bull appears to have stumbled into it early. From a regulatory standpoint, this creates an almost impossible challenge. Nothing about this behavior is explicitly forbidden. It emerges from legal systems interacting exactly as written. But the regulations were never intended to reward driver-car synergy so asymmetrically. The FIA now has to consider whether this kind of emergent advantage is something to be celebrated or quietly constrained. And history suggests that once racing begins, the appetite to intervene drops sharply, even if concerns remain. Which leaves the story suspended in a dangerous place. Red Bull hasn't finished refining what it's found. Ford hasn't finished stress testing its limits. And Verstappen hasn't yet shown what it looks like when he fully trusts it. But the shape of the threat is already clear. If this behavior survives into 2026 unchanged, Red Bull won't just have a fast car. They'll have one that removes doubt at the exact moment other drivers still feel it. And in Formula One, the driver who never hesitates is usually the one everyone else ends up chasing. As this discovery is examined more closely, a new kind of fear starts to replace the initial shock. Because this isn't something rivals can counter with a single upgrade or clever workaround. What Red Bull appears to have unlocked with Ford lives in the space between systems, where responsibility is shared and therefore hard to isolate. If you try to copy the electrical behavior without the mechanical context, it doesn't work. If you copy the mechanical balance without the software logic, it collapses. That interdependence is what makes this so dangerous. It creates an advantage that can't be attacked directly, only indirectly, and indirect battles are always slower. What's becoming clear is that this behavior fundamentally alters how a race unfolds from inside the cockpit. Drivers normally spend the first laps learning what the car will allow them to do. Where it bites. Where it forgives. Where it surprises them. The Red Bull data suggests the learning curve is dramatically shortened. The car communicates its limits immediately and consistently. That allows a driver to commit earlier, lap after lap, without mentally buffering for unpredictability. For Verstappen, that removes one of the last variables that normally equalizes talent over a race distance. There is also an important knock-on effect that isn't immediately obvious. When a car behaves predictably under load, engineers can be bolder with setup and strategy. They don't have to protect against unknown reactions. They can push closer to theoretical limits because the feedback loop is tighter. That accelerates development. It means Red Bull won't just race better on Sundays. They'll learn faster on Fridays and Saturdays. And learning speed is often the deciding factor in long regulation cycles. Rivals are increasingly concerned that this advantage will be misread publicly once racing begins. If Red Bull wins by small margins, it will look beatable. If Verstappen manages tires effortlessly, it will be attributed to driving style. If strategies work repeatedly, it will be called execution. But internally, teams may already know those outcomes are symptoms, not causes. That's the worst-case scenario in Formula One. When everyone can see the result, but only one team understands the mechanism behind it. Another layer of tension comes from how this discovery interacts with Verstappen's psychology. Max doesn't need reassurance to push. But when reassurance exists, he becomes relentless. A car that never surprises him under braking, throttle, or energy deployment allows him to apply pressure continuously rather than selectively. That kind of pressure breaks rivals mentally before it breaks them technically. They start reacting instead of executing. And once that happens, gaps grow even if raw performance remains close. Inside the FIA, this situation is beginning to be discussed in abstract terms rather than technical ones. Not is this legal, but is this what the regulations were meant to reward? That distinction matters. Because legality is easy to judge. Intent is not. If a system emerges that disproportionately amplifies certain driving styles and philosophies, regulators have to decide whether that's innovation or imbalance. And that decision rarely happens cleanly or quickly. Which is why this story remains unresolved by design. Red Bull hasn't finished refining this behavior. Ford hasn't finished exploring its boundaries. And the rest of the grid hasn't yet seen it under real racing stress. But the direction of travel is already clear. If this discovery survives into competition unchanged, it won't announce itself loudly. It will show up in calm radios, controlled stints, and a driver who never looks rushed. And by the time rivals realize what they're truly fighting, the advantage may already be built into the way the sport itself is being driven. As the implications of this discovery continue to ripple outward, a final layer of concern begins to dominate conversations inside rival teams. Because once a car starts behaving this way, it changes how mistakes are punished. Normally, pushing too hard creates instability. Instability creates tire damage. Tire damage creates lap time loss. That chain is how the field stays compressed. What Red Bull appears to have softened is that chain itself. Errors don't cascade as brutally, which means a driver like Verstappen can live closer to the edge for longer without paying the usual price. This has profound consequences over a season, not just a race. A car that tolerates constant pressure reduces fatigue. Mental and physical. It allows the driver to operate in a narrower cognitive bandwidth, saving energy for moments that actually matter. Over 24 races, that matters enormously. Margins that look small on paper start to feel overwhelming when one driver is always operating at 95% effort while others fluctuate between 85 and 100 just to stay in touch. That asymmetry is how dominance becomes routine. There's also a development feedback loop that worries engineers deeply. When a car behaves consistently, data becomes cleaner. Cleaner data leads to clearer conclusions. Clear conclusions lead to faster iteration. Red Bull doesn't just gain on track. They gain in understanding. Every test, every practice session, every race becomes more informative because the car isn't masking issues behind erratic behavior. That learning advantage compounds quietly, race after race, while others are still separating signal from noise. What's striking is how closely this aligns with Red Bull's recent organizational behavior. They haven't been chasing radical visual concepts. They haven't been flooding the paddock with visible innovation. Instead, they've focused on control. Control of energy. Control of balance. Control of how the car responds when things aren't perfect. This discovery fits that philosophy too neatly to feel accidental. Even if it wasn't planned, it's perfectly suited to the way Red Bull already thinks about racing. For Verstappen, this may represent the most complete platform he's ever had. Not the fastest in absolute terms, but the one that allows him to express his driving style without negotiation. When that happens, Verstappen doesn't look spectacular. He looks inevitable. Corners stop looking dramatic. Overtakes look simple. Defenses look effortless. That's usually the sign that the car is doing something others can't see, not that the driver is trying harder. The rest of the grid now faces an uncomfortable waiting game. They won't know how real this advantage is until it's too late to react cleanly. Early races will offer clues, but not answers. And once the answers arrive, architectural changes will already be impossible. That's the quiet danger of discoveries like this. They don't demand immediate panic. They reward patience on one side and punish it everywhere else. And this is why the story refuses to close here. Because what Red Bull and Ford have uncovered isn't finished. It's still being understood, refined, protected. If it survives the next phase of scrutiny, it won't just define the RB22's behavior. It will redefine what teams believe is possible under the 2026 regulations. And by the time that belief shifts across the paddock, Max Verstappen may already be racing in a reality the rest of Formula One is still trying to understand.